Welcome back for the second part of One Man's Faith today. And now let's go to our series or our study that we've been studying for the past several weeks, Hebrews, the book of Hebrews. And we are now in chapter 4 of Hebrews, and we're going to be looking at the last half of that chapter. But let's look back just a little bit. Chapter 1 was a comparison of Jesus and the angels and how much higher Jesus is. Chapter 2 of Hebrews is a comparison of Jesus and man and how he was higher than man, but he had to come down and be man to be able to redeem man. Chapter 3 starts off with the comparison of Jesus and Moses and how that Jesus was like Moses in that he was over the house. All right, as Moses was part of the house that he brought out of Egypt, and he tells us that we must hold fast our confidence and our boast in hope, firm to the end. Firm to the end. This is kind of an if clause. He says, Christ, verse 6 of chapter 3, Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope firm until the end. In other words, we stand firm in the fact that Jesus is Lord. He is my Lord, and I am walking with him. And I know that he's given me promises, and he's keeping those promises. Okay? And then he starts to compare us with Israel. And he says, today, if you hear his voice, just as I was mentioning earlier, today, listen, if you don't know the Lord, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart as they did in the wilderness. And we looked at that, at least one example of that in the wilderness where they didn't listen. And it continues over into chapter 4. He says, therefore, let us fear while there's a promise remaining of entering that rest. And we talked about rest being abode, abiding with God. Okay, let us fear while there's a promise remaining that any one of us may seem to have come short of it. How? By hearing the word and not putting faith behind it. Okay? He says it this way. For we indeed have had good news preached to us, just as they also, but the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard. For we who have believed entered that rest, just as he said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter. Okay, so what the writer is saying is, listen, let us fear while there's a promise of entering that rest. Let's go ahead. Let us be diligent. Let's enter. He goes in verse 6 and says, therefore, since it remains for some to enter, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed because of their disobedience, he again fixes a day saying today, even though they failed, it's today for you. It will be tomorrow, will be today for you. Every day is today until you take your last breath, and there are no more todays. This land, it was a time of rest. No more war, or should have been no more war. Had they run everybody out the way they were supposed to, it would have been. But he goes on and he says, let us be diligent to enter that rest. Remember just a little while ago he said, let us fear while there's a promise remaining of that rest that we enter it. Now he says, be diligent, use speed to enter that rest, so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience. And we talked last week about disobedience is unbelief. They're equal. We don't obey because we don't believe. It's an important concept. We have got to believe he will do what he said he will do. the promises that he gives us. We have got to believe them. And he says right after that, he says, for the word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, and piercing as far as the division of soul and spirit, of both joints and marrow, and able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. How does that fit in with being diligent to enter that rest? Because the Word of God opens things up for us so that we're not following that same disobedience. The word disobedience is unbelief. Same example of disbelief. Obstinate and rebellious. Unpersuadable. You don't want to be that way. We don't want to be unpersuadable. We want to be persuaded by the Word and believe God for it. See, it takes faith to believe. We have got to believe that what God said He would do, and that He will do it. We got to believe that it's part of our walk with the Lord, to allow Him to lead us, to allow Him to use us. You know, He wants you, no matter where you're at. He's given you a job. It was built into you. And He wants you to fulfill it. Whether that is being a doctor who relies upon the healing faith of Jesus to heal, or a lawyer relying upon righteousness and truth, or a businessman relying upon Him to supply your needs and to give you the download in how to do what He's called you to do the best way possible. All these things are part of what He wants you to do, and they're part of understanding that we've got to believe Him. We've got to believe Him. We've got to walk His way. We've got to let Him tell us what to do. After all, He's Lord. He's Lord. He has that right. As a matter of fact, that's kind of the stuff that got them in trouble. If we'll look over in Psalm 78, flip over to Psalm 78. Let's look at a couple of these things. Let's look at a couple of these things, because we need to understand the Word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, okay? Understand, it's not saying that the sword, because the sword here, if you remember from our previous set, was Makahira, which was a single blade sword. But it says it's as sharp as a two-edged sword. Okay, so it's able to pierce and divide, and so we can get away from not believing by allowing the Word of God to take out those areas where we do disbelieve. Understand what I'm saying? There are going to be areas in our lives where we may not believe, but we need to believe. And so what we've got to understand is that if we accept Jesus as Lord, that's by faith. And we've got to accept His Word by faith the same way and learn to walk with Him, not in our own might, but in His might, okay? Psalm 78 will start in just a second, but we got to take a break. I'll be right back.